Let us go beyond the surface, beyond the missiles, the maps, the memorandums of military action, and ask what truly fuels the Israel-Iran crisis. What we're witnessing isn't just geopolitical standoff between rival states. It is, more profoundly, a reflection of timeless human psychology at play. Power, fear, control, and the spiritual blindness that grips those who lead without vision. The visible conflict is only the consequence. The invisible drivers, those forces that operate beneath the surface, are the true cause. And in the realm of high-stakes global affairs, as in personal achievement, causes always precede effects. Napoleon Hill taught us that behind every visible result lies an invisible causing a belief, a fear, a desire, or a dominating thought. This same principle applies to nations. When Israel launches preemptive strikes or Iran mobilizes its proxies, the action is visible. But the driver is invisible. It is rooted in the psychology of survival, the desperation for security, and the unrelenting hunger to be the dominant actor in a chaotic region. Now, let's examine this through the lens of psychological law. When individuals feel insecure, they overcompensate. They seek external control to mask internal uncertainty. The same applies to nations. Israel, a nation surrounded by perceived threats, has long adopted a strategy of preemption and deterrence. Its doctrine is not random. It is born of centuries of collective trauma and the determination to never again be caught vulnerable. This isn't just strategy, it's emotionally anchored policy. And Iran, steeped in historical resistance to foreign domination, carries its own psychological scares, both from imperial interference and regional marginalization. It too seeks control, not just over territory, but over its own narrative, its own dignity, and its future place in the world order. So, when missiles fly or threats are exchanged, it's not merely politics. It's human emotion scaled up to a national level. That's what many analysts miss. They speak of treaties, alliances, and military capabilities, but ignore the underlying emotional fuel. Just as Napoleon Hill taught that fear is the mind's greatest enemy, we now see fear as the architect of national policy. Fear of being attacked, fear of losing influence, fear of internal collapse. And make no mistake, fear makes for dangerous decisions because it breeds aggression masked defense. If we examine the current escalation, we see both Israel and Iran operating from a defensive posture disguised as offense. Israel's recent actions in Syria, Gaza, and beyond are not random shows of strength. They are calculated signals, embedded with psychological messaging. We are not afraid. We are in control. But that's the illusion. Control gained through domination is always temporary. As Hill wrote, real power comes not from force but from mastery over self. The same law applies to nations. Those who cannot master their fears will always seek control over others. And such control is fragile because it depends on force rather than influence. Iran, in turn, relies heavily on proxies. Hezbollah, Houthis, militias across the region, not merely for strategic depth, but to maintain the image of strength. These are not just military tools. They are psychological extensions of Tehran's will. Iran knows it cannot match Israel in direct military capacity, nor outpace Western technology. But what it can do is project psychological chaos to prove that it remains relevant, capable, and feared. Again, this is not a rational strategy alone. It is a defensive psychology at work. If I cannot win outright, I will not let you win either. But here's the deeper truth. Neither of these nations is truly in control, because the real control, true, sustained power, comes not from arms but from clarity of purpose, unity of vision, and moral consistency. This is what separates great leaders from powerful ones. And this is where the crisis spirals further. Because both Israel and Iran are, in different ways, drifting from internal mastery into external dependence, dependence on military superiority, dependence on foreign alliances, dependence on perpetual fear to justify national cohesion. This is dangerous. And it leads us to a profound philosophical conclusion. When fear becomes the glue that holds a nation together, war becomes inevitable. Because fear demands a target, it needs an enemy to define itself. And in that cycle, peace becomes impossible, not because it's undesirable, but because it threatens the very structure that sustains the national identity. What then can be done? We must begin by understanding this conflict as not only political or strategic, but as psychological and philosophical. That is the beginning of real solutions. Solutions that do not merely postpone war but dissolve the emotional causes of war. Napoleon Hill believed that change begins with the individual mind. But we can also say, change begins when national minds confront their shadow, their insecurity, their wounded pride, their unhealed past. Until Israel, Iran, and by extension their global partners, look inward, no outward solution will endure. Diplomacy without self-awareness is manipulation. Agreements made in fear collapse under pressure. And now I invite you, the thinker, the citizen of the world, to reflect on how often do we, in our personal lives, respond to fear with control? How often do we confuse dominance with security? The lesson is the same. Whether in the heart of a man or the heart of a nation, we are in an age where the old structures are crumbling and the new ones are not yet born. In such times, clarity is rare and wisdom is needed more than ever. This crisis between Israel and Iran is not just a story of war. It is a mirror reflecting back to us the cost of fear, the fragility of control, and the urgent need for vision rooted in mastery of self. Let us not merely watch history unfold. Let us understand it, and from that understanding, let us grow. Let us turn our attention now to a war far more subtle and far more dangerous than the one fought with drones, missiles, and military doctrine. I'm talking about the war for the mind, the war for narrative, for meaning, for perception. You see, while the Israel-Iran crisis unfolds on the battlefield, there is a parallel crisis playing out with equal intensity in the media, in the language of leaders, in the manipulation of public sentiment. It is the crisis of interpretation, of whose version of reality becomes the reality. In this modern conflict, the front lines run not only through deserts or urban landscapes, they run through screens, headlines, hashtags, and hearts. Each side seeks not only to destroy or deter, but to convince, to convert, to justify. And this battle, the battle to define who is the victim and who is the aggressor, is often more decisive than any strike or sanction, because people don't respond only to facts, they respond to frames. And whoever frames the story is the world's response. Napoleon Hill often spoke of autosuggestion, that quiet, persistent whisper we repeat to ourselves until it becomes belief. Now imagine that on a national scale. Entire populations are being conditioned not necessarily to know, but to believe, to internalize a version of events so thoroughly that doubt itself feels like betrayal. This is the power of narrative. It doesn't merely inform, it informs identity, and once identity is involved, objectivity dies. Both Israel and Iran have mastered this psychological weapon. Israel emphasizes its right to defend itself, a message shaped by its historical trauma and the ever-present rhetoric of annihilation it hears from Tehran. That narrative works. It's persuasive. It's anchored in survival, in emotion, in memory. But let's be honest, it's also curated. Like all nations, Israel selects the aspects of the truth that serve its interest. It tells a version of the story that secures legitimacy on the world stage. It uses vocabulary like defense, precision, and deterrence. These are not just words, they are tools, instruments of public persuasion. Iran, too, is engaged in narrative warfare. It positions itself as the voice of resistance, resistance to imperialism, to Zionism, to Western interference. It speaks in the language of revolution and dignity, of standing tall against oppression. And that, too, is a compelling story, especially in a region scarred by colonialism and exploitation. But again, it's a story with layers, truth and manipulation woven together so tightly that cannot be pulled apart from the other without unraveling both. And so we see that the modern battlefield includes CNN and Al Jazeera, Twitter feeds and Telegram channels, press briefings and staged footage. We're no longer watching events unfold. We're watching interpretations of events filtered through algorithms, ideologies, and emotional biases. Why does this matter? Because when the mind becomes the battlefield, truth becomes a casualty. And without truth, without at least the pursuit of it, we are doomed to act on illusion. When masses are fed emotional distortions instead of clarity, when people form opinions based on repetition rather than reasoning, then escalation is not only likely, it becomes inevitable. This is where the psychological dimension deepens. In Hill's philosophy, the mind is the gateway to all power or all failure. What you allow into your mind determines the direction of your destiny. So let me ask you, what kind of ideas are we allowing into the global mind? What kind of emotional vibrations are fed into the public consciousness? The answer: fear, pride, outrage, and vengeance. These are the emotional currencies being traded in the narrative economy. And like any toxic currency, they devalue the human spirit and inflate hostility. You see, people often believe that wars are caused by hate. That's not quite right. Wars are caused by stories about hate. Stories that tell us we are justified in our anger. Stories that paint the other side as monstrous, irrational, or less than human. These narratives allow us to sleep at night, even as cities burn and children are buried. The mind must be convinced before the trigger is pulled. And once that mental permission is granted, the body simply follows through. But here lies the hidden opportunity. Because if belief can ignite conflict, then belief can also inspire peace. If minds can be shaped toward destruction, then they can be shaped toward understanding. Not agreement, necessarily, but understanding. And that begins with questioning the stories we're told. With asking, who benefits from this narrative? What is missing from this picture? And what am I being conditioned to feel? True wisdom is not found in taking sides blindly. True wisdom is the ability to suspend judgment long enough to seek clarity. It is the courage to confront uncomfortable truths, both in others and in ourselves. Hill taught that we must guard our minds as we would guard a treasure chest. Because whatever enters the mind, repeated often enough, becomes part of who we are. That's not just motivational thinking, that is neuropolitical reality. Governments, media outlets, ideologues, they all understand this. That is why they repeat slogans, why they stage visuals, why they flood timelines with messages tailored not to inform, but to condition. If you want to control a population, you don't need chains. You need stories. And if you tell the story well enough, the people will build their own chains, believing them to be shields. But we are not powerless. In fact, as consumers of information, as citizens of conscience, we are the final line of defense against manipulation. We must reclaim the responsibility to think, to question, and to see through the fog of narrative warfare. The mind once awakened cannot be deceived in the same way again. So, let us not fall into the trap of binary thinking. Let us not speak only in terms of right and wrong, us and them. That is the language of division, the vocabulary of war. Let us instead ask higher order questions. What is the deeper need beneath this conflict? What human wounds are being exploited? What emotional truths are being denied? And finally, let us remember that the stories we tell become the realities we live tomorrow. If we are ever to see a future beyond this crisis, it will not come through domination of territory, but through liberation of thought. Because in the end, it is not missiles that shape the destiny of nations. It is the ideas that guide the minds that launch them.